First of all, let me thank Ilya and the Academy for inviting me, and I've been here several times now, and I'm afraid I'm speaking English. But what I'm going to do, which is something that I do very often when I speak, is to type some key concepts and things that I'm mentioning, so that if you want to bring them up, my understanding is we'll have a little bit of time for questions at the end, and you can ask about it. There's also this Russian text, which I can't really vouch for one way or another, but my argument will roughly follow what the text says. So first of all, what I want to do is to give you a sense of what the basic concept of the talk is in terms of, and it's reflected in the title of the talk, because I think these things will be relatively new, not only to you guys, but also I think to the English speakers as well. And it has to do with developments that are taking place in science now, and the way in which societies contract with science is being renegotiated. Okay? And so there are a couple of key terms that I introduce, and one of them is the customization of science. And the other one is what I call Protscience. Okay? And both of these terms have fairly specific meanings. When I talk about customization of science, I'm actually drawing a distinction between the customer, right, and the consumer. In English, and I'm sure in other languages, this distinction often gets blurred. But I'm making a kind of an important distinction here, which is one that you find actually in the marketing literature. And so the idea here being that the customer is someone who's interested in buying something, but not necessarily because they're going to use it. Okay? So this is the sense in which a customer can be someone other than a consumer. Okay? So if we talk about retail versus wholesale in business, right? The wholesaler produces things en masse, and the retailer buys from the wholesaler, but the retailer isn't necessarily using what is being bought. Okay, that's kind of where the distinction comes from initially. And what I'm arguing here is that we are actually living in a period where science is becoming customized in this sense. In other words, people are interested in purchasing science, learning about science, but not necessarily in using it or believing it in the way in which the scientists themselves put forward. Okay? And I think this is kind of a very important kind of distinction to make here. So one of the things that we find typically in the West when one does surveys of the public understanding of science is that more and more people are interested in science, and they will watch television programs and read popular books and all the rest of it. However, the more they find out about science, the more they actually disagree with what scientific authorities say. In other words, they take a rather independent line on science the more they find out about it. Okay? Now, this is a very unexpected finding, especially from the standpoint of the authorities in science. Okay? Because there's been this long-standing view among scientific elites especially, that the more people learn about science, the more their opinions will be the same as the scientists. Okay? In other words, to be a customer for science is to be a consumer for science and to buy the stuff and to use it oneself. But this is not what's happening. People are developing very independent views about science, even as they find out more and more about it. Okay? And in the paper, I talk about many different controversies that have erupted in the Western world, and we can talk about, for example, the creationism evolution controversy. We can talk about the climate change issues that are taking place now. We can talk about the debates over whether to use homeopathy and other alternative forms of medicine. All of these different ideas, one of the things that's very interesting about it is that the people who disagree with the scientific authorities often know quite a lot of science. Okay? I mean, one can argue about specific things, but these are not people who are ignorant or anti-science. They're, in a sense, people who, as it were, have reinterpreted the science for themselves. Okay? Now, this brings me then to Protscience. Okay? And Protscience is basically a contracted form of Protestant science. Okay? And in the history of Christianity, Protestantism, as you may know, was the moment in the history where the people took back religion for themselves. They no longer just trusted the priests. They no longer just said, well, you know, if it's in Latin, it's an authority, and I've just got to believe it mindlessly. No, people decided to read the Bible for themselves in a serious way and to interpret those results in ways that were directly relevant to their lives. This is what the Protestant Reformation was about. Prior to the Protestant Reformation, there was not a lot of Bible reading in Christianity. Christianity was about going to church, believing what the priest said, but there wasn't a lot of literacy, there wasn't a lot of reading for oneself. Okay? And so the Protestant Reformation actually is very closely connected historically with the rise of the printing press and the rise of literacy as a movement. Now, now, as you know also, right, one of the consequences of the Protestant Reformation, one of the things that came out of it, was the scientific revolution. Okay? And if you look at people like Francis Bacon, right, and even people who remained nominally Catholic, like Descartes and Galileo, right, all of these people were dissenting Christians. They were not Christians who, as it were, just listened to what the priest said, but interpreted the religion for themselves, and they found it empowering. Okay? Now, what I am arguing here is that a similar phenomenon is happening now, but within the realm of science. Okay? Whereas science, you might say, benefited from the Protestant Reformation in terms of becoming the new source of authority, that authority, the authority of science, is now being eroded by a movement that is very similar to what happened in the 16th and 17th centuries. And instead of the printing press, what one would point to here is something like the internet, and also the spread of mass education, and also the spread of popular journalism. All of these different ways of finding out about science makes people more informed, but also it empowers them to disagree with established authorities. And this is something that we are seeing increasingly and in a way that is unprecedented, actually. And so that a lot of movements that scientific authorities thought had been completely dead, like alternative medicine, like creationism, okay, they're back on the table. And they're back on the table in a more intelligent form, forcing the whole scientific debate to move to another level. And it's a level where there's going to be a lot of conflict, and it's not clear how it's going to be resolved. But this is the kind of world that we're moving into now, where people are feeling personally empowered by science. And one of the ways you can see this happening, right, is that people are beginning to take quite seriously an idea that was very strong in the Protestant Reformation, and that was, you live the faith. So what you believe isn't just an abstraction that you test, right, in some isolated setting like a laboratory, but what you believe is something you embody. It is who you are, and if it turns out that what you say, what you believe is wrong, and you die, let's say, because you don't have adequate medical treatment or whatever, then you live with it. You're happy to do that. You want the choice. Okay? The choice is what matters. Okay? And I think this is a world, it seems to me, which, again, one of the consequences is if we take this world seriously, it opens up the sphere of risk. An enormous amount of risk gets opened up. And this is a problem that I don't think, we have faced very squarely yet, but is one that I think is one of the consequences once people start, as it were, incorporating science into themselves, into their everyday lives, and then live accordingly. Okay? So this is a very interesting issue. Again, this is not a new issue. What's different is that in the scientific revolution, we talked a lot about test beliefs, testing things, right? So experimentation of the sort of Francis Bacon happened in very selected, specialized settings. But now we're talking about people using their own lives as the test space for their beliefs, much more explicitly, okay? And I think there's an interesting sense in which this kind of development that I'm talking about here, this customization of science, it's a real test of what democracy means in a way, okay? If you go back to the 16th and 17th centuries, one of the things that you will see is that theologians and priests very often thought that if people try to interpret the Bible for themselves, they'll just be led to do all kinds of crazy things. And indeed, a lot of them did do a lot of crazy things, right? The history of Protestantism is a very mixed bag, okay? No doubt about it. But nevertheless, that is normally seen as a stepping stone in the direction of democracy. And what we are now is we're at a period where something similar may have to be said about science. That in a sense, people will be living with science in many different ways, okay? And then we have to see what kind of a society do we have at the end where we allow this kind of diversity of interpretations of scientific views. And here it makes no sense to talk about anti-science. This has nothing to do with anti-science. This has to do with everybody taking science very seriously, taking it personally, as I put it in the paper, but nevertheless taking it in different directions. And this is the kind of issue that, in a sense, we're facing now. How much more time do I have?
15.
Is that correct? The chairs?
22.
I have 22 left? Okay. We'll go for 22. Okay, so I've made this initial distinction between the customer and the consumer for science, and I've talked about this idea of Protscience, and I want to now get into a little more detail about how exactly does this happen. And I think the first thing is, let's think about the internet for a moment. There are many ways of getting scientific information, not just by listening to scientific authorities, but by going on the internet. And the internet has information that is available to people who have different kinds of backgrounds, different levels of intelligence. So everyone can have a view about something, potentially, okay? And what that means, all of that exposure of information at the same time opens up the sphere of accountability. Because then people can ask questions. People can wonder, is this really what you're saying? What does this mean? What is the evidence? And it is interesting how so much of the controversies that we see about science today have to do with issues of evidence. Right? Because people are operating on the assumption that they believe they are interpreting science the right way unless you show me evidence to the contrary. Why shouldn't I do this? What exactly is wrong with what I'm saying? In other words, you do not assume the authority is right. You assume you actually understand what's going on, and then you ask the other party to test your claim, to defeat your claim. This is how we get the controversies that we have in science today, very much in this fashion, where people are not taking authority for granted anymore. Authority has to be earned. A very important point. Now, as I also said, science, this is happening at lots of different levels. And so here I want to draw to your attention science journalism. People have many different attitudes towards science journalism, but certainly it is encouraging this trend that I'm talking about. And one of the ways in which it encourages this trend is by providing independent bases for analyzing and evaluating scientific opinion. And so, again, I realize this person may not be familiar to you, but in the United Kingdom, there is a journalist who is very much, he's in the Guardian newspaper. He's a trained medical scientist with a degree from Oxford. His name is Ben Goldacre. He's written a lot of popular books. He's a very interesting person in this discussion because this guy often presents himself, and he's not the only one, as defending science from itself. Okay? In other words, what he does is he takes scientific papers and he reanalyzes them. Right? So he looks to see whether the statistics are right. He looks to see whether data has been fudged or in some way distorted. And he also looks at who's funding the research to see if there's some motivation for the scientists not to be telling the truth. He claims to be speaking for science. He is not an academic, he is a journalist, but he is one with a PhD. He is trained, and he is an independent agent who puts himself forward as someone who is upholding the norms of science as they are normally understood. So he's not arguing for some creationism or alternative medicine or anything like that, but what he's showing is that what the scientists are doing on their own terms is false. Now you see, there's a lot of science journalism, which in a way is a kind of version of what is more familiar, investigative journalism, right? In politics. Right? Politicians say all kinds of things. But then you have to analyze what they say. Right? This is being extended to science. And the people who do investigative journalism are upholding the values of democracy, are upholding the same values that the politicians claim to be upholding, but are not. Okay? And this is what science journalism is doing. It's giving you this independent base. And as you may recall, from the Protestant Reformation, one of the problems with the church was corruption. Right? People trusted it, but did they have reason to trust it? Was it actually living up to its own standards? You see, this is a similar kind of development that we're seeing now happening in science, and this is among people who do not have kind of weird, new age, alternative views of things. These are people who believe in exactly the same norms. And it's this kind of process is part of what's going on here with the Protscience. It's that too. And one shouldn't underestimate the significance of that in terms of undermining sort of the classical authorities of science. And of course, because Ben Goldacre writes in newspapers and writes in popular books, part of what he's telling you is that you too, if you spend enough time, can also analyze this stuff for yourself. Right? That's kind of part of the rhetoric of this. That you just need to be an intelligent, alert person, and you can do this yourself. So this is potentially incredibly controversial. Now, one of the things that I talk about in the paper is a recent episode where, in a sense, the kind of ambiguity, difficulties surrounding this kind of transition taking place in the public understanding of science caused enormous disaster. And so I talk about this earthquake in Italy, L'Aquila in Italy. I don't know if you recall it. This was in 2012, and this was an earthquake where something like 300 people died, 1,600 people were wounded, and 100,000 people had to leave their homes. Okay? Now, the key thing about this earthquake was that the geologists and the seismologists, the people who were supposed to know about this stuff, basically publicly said, and had the support of the politicians, that the probability of the earthquake was small, very small. Okay? Now, it is also clear, because there was a trial, and basically these scientists were put in jail for many years, until last week. Again, if you know about this story, you know last week this has been reversed. But I think the story itself is very interesting in terms of the difficulty, in terms of who takes responsibility for what. Who takes responsibility in science, okay? Because the argument that was accepted by the judge to convict the scientists was that the people trusted the scientists and the scientists misled them, okay? And the politicians, it's clear, wanted the science, or were inclined to think that a small probability meant less of a chance of the earthquake. They didn't want people to have they didn't want people to get scared or frightened or anything, right? They wanted them to stay calm. So they were interested in the idea that people didn't think an earthquake was happening. But the point is, why should the scientists be the ones responsible? The scientists, as it were, did not say anything false from a strict standpoint, right? They actually gave accurate information. The public did not understand it, and the politicians didn't help matters. That's basically what the facts are of this case. Now, what this represents, it seems to me, is that we are in a kind of in-between zone. We are in a sort of middle position at the moment. Okay? Where in some sense, people still trust the scientists too much, but at the same time, they are not quite willing to know or to learn or to put in the effort to find out all they need to find out to be able to take full responsibility for themselves in terms of what they do. Right? Because to be a true believer in Protscience, you have to, as it were, look at the figures, look at the statistics, and then say at the end, yes, I'll stay in my home, or no, I will leave my home, and whatever happens in the world, I take responsibility. It is my fault, it was my decision. I am not going to blame some scientist for it. Okay, this is what Protscience ultimately is about. And so what you could imagine in a situation like this earthquake situation is that different people would take different decisions. Some will stay, some will go, but nobody would sue the scientists as long as the scientists represented the data accurately. It would be the responsibility of the people involved. That would be the ideal scenario as we move into a world of Protscience. And in that case, then, the scientists don't have to worry about this issue that I think hangs over the whole discussion, and that's paternalism. Right? The idea that you really can't trust people knowing the facts because they're too stupid. And so what you have to do is you have to tell them something slightly different that gets them to do the right thing. Even if that means that you have to corrupt the actual facts of the case. Paternalism. And this is the thing, this is the big enemy, it seems to me, from the standpoint of moving to Protscience. Because at the end of the day, what you ideally want is you want the scientists to speak the truth, as they see it. But you also want people to be free to make decisions based on their understanding of the truth. And that may go in different directions. And this is the kind of world, in a sense, that I think we're very gradually moving into. But I think that one of the consequences of this, and so in the final part of the full paper, I talk about the way scientists deal with this. Because in a sense, I think, the public is quite ready to embrace attitudes of democracy and freedom and all this kind of stuff. And they already are finding out more and more about science in a very willing way. But then I think the question is, what happens to science as an authority? That is the open question. How do scientists deal with this issue? How do scientists deal with this issue in a way that is not just reactionary and negative? Because as you know, there were lots of wars of religion in Europe in the 16th century, right? The church didn't go down easily. And so it seems to me this is the kind of problem that we face now is how do the scientific authorities deal with what is effectively a very radical democratization of science taking place. Am my time over, or go ahead? 10 minutes. 10 minutes? My goodness. Well, I want to, there are two things that I want to bring up in the end here, okay, since I've got the 10 minutes. And it's about the way scientists have dealt with the various problems of their changing role in society, okay? For those of you who believe that scientists need in some way to reassert their authority in society, that in a sense these kinds of developments I'm talking about are in a way too radical, I recommend you a book. The Geek Manifesto. I don't know if you've heard of it. It's a British book. The guy who wrote the book, his name is Mark Henderson. Mark Henderson is a guy who's done a lot of public relations over the years he did public relations for the Royal Society, which is kind of the British Vatican of science, right? Also for the Wellcome Trust, which is kind of the main medical charity in the UK. So he sort of understands kind of the kinds of things I'm talking about, and he's frightened in a way and disturbed. And so what he is arguing is for a reassertion of scientific authority, but in what I would call, and again, I think for some of you old Marxists out there, you might appreciate this, petite bourgeois kind of way. If you understand something about the dynamics of this, in the world of science, there are, of course, the major players. They are the people who get the Nobel Prizes. They are the fellows of the Royal Society. They are the important people. They are the people who actually do the original research on which the basis of scientific authority comes. But then there's this whole other bunch of people, the people who apply that knowledge in various ways. And of course, in the recent times, in the period in which we live over the last 25 years, we've got this phenomenon of geeks. People who, for the most part, work as, let's say, laboratory technicians or, IT people, right? These are people who have a kind of scientific background, but and they identify very strongly with science, and they read a lot of science fiction, and they're very pro-science, and they very much identify with the more authoritative aspects of science. But they themselves have very little to do with the actual production of scientific knowledge. They're sort of in the bottom end of things, but they identify very strongly. And Henderson is appealing to those people. He is appealing to those people to be the ones who reassert the authority of science, and to basically put a kind of more up-to-date, modern face on paternalism. Okay? Where people believe what the scientists say. And if you follow a lot of the controversies that take place surrounding science, especially on the internet, you will see a lot of this phenomenon happening. It doesn't happen in academic journals very much, but it does happen on the internet a lot, and the internet is a lot of where intellectual stuff happens these days, in case you didn't know. Okay? That, in fact, maybe most of the intellectual world happens on the internet these days. And it's here where these people are actually quite a strong voice. Okay? And so I think that's a very interesting kind of viewpoint. But the thing that is equally interesting about this is that these guys, these people behind the Geek Manifesto, they're just asserting the authority of science in a way for its own sake. In other words, because scientists say that 95% of scientists believe global warming is happening so that the temperature of the Earth will rise 2 degrees centigrade in 50 years, you should therefore believe it. It's that straightforward. It's that dogmatic. Okay? It's not really about scientists in some sense leading people in a more enlightened, more empowered direction. Because I think this is one thing that separates the geek manifesto and the people who kind of buy into this idea from what we call the Enlightenment, the 18th century movement, which in a way was a secularization of the Protestant Reformation. Okay? In the Enlightenment was a very anti-authoritarian movement. And most of the people of the Enlightenment did not believe that science should become the new church. Okay? I mean, Auguste Comte did, but that's a little later. But in the Enlightenment, most of the people believed that in fact science was something for self and collective empowerment. Right? And that everyone should have access to that knowledge. And that it should not be a matter of replacing the Pope of religion with the Pope of science. Okay? And it seems to me that it's this kind of attitude that the scientific community needs to stand behind more directly, more explicitly. And so that in fact, somebody like Ben Goldacre, the journalist who I mentioned earlier from The Guardian, is actually much more a person behind the Enlightenment, okay, than in fact somebody like Mark Henderson. And I think, you know, and I will close here, I think there's a sense in which we need to kind of get a sense of the two different ways in which the scientific community can think about its future in light of this customization and this general Protscience. On the one hand, it may just try to reassert its authority and try to do it at a popular, maybe even populist level. And that's where Mark Henderson is coming from. But on the other hand, there may be an enlightenment moment for science here, where the people no longer believe in the authority of science means that they actually take more responsibility for it, and they in fact use it as a kind of agent of empowerment, even though it can end up having very risky and even very damaging consequences. Because as you know, at the end of the Enlightenment, we got the French Revolution. Okay? So it's not that what I'm recommending here is some kind of pleasant future. But what I am recommending is one where science remains very central and important in people's lives and remains very self-empowering and not just becomes a new form of authority again as a result of reaction. And I'll stop here. Thank you.
У нас есть несколько минут для вопросов и комментариев. Пожалуйста, профессор Ротин.
Thank you very much for very, very interesting lecture. I just wonder how much this phenomenon, social phenomenon you are describing, how much this is universal, or rather represents, say, some local development in UK. What I have in mind, for example, if you are thinking about Enlightenment times, I think you would find kind of similar difference between, say, Royal Society or continental academies, right? And then if we are talking about this public engagement into science, also there are very different effects. There is one wonderful book I recently read by Italian researcher Gabriele Stella called Science and Revolution, about the impact that this popular science gave into Russian Revolution in late 19th and early 20th century. You see? So I think that these effects could be probably very different dependently on what society you are in. So I just wonder.
Yes, of course. You're absolutely correct. And I would say that I do know about several different societies. I would say Britain probably has the most advanced kind of version of this issue, in that people are very self-conscious. We've got clear people taking clear views on these matters already. That's true. But as you know, right, the Enlightenment was a movement that took almost a century to happen, and it spread slowly, right, from France and England to the rest of Europe. And there were people who were quite active in promoting it, moving from place to place. Of course, the French guys came over here, for example, and made a lot of noise. And it seems to me that there's a sense in which this is happening now, but it is happening within a somewhat shorter time frame, I think. So that what may have taken close to a century to happen across Europe in the 18th century could maybe take a generation. Okay?
But still you think it's the same progressive movement?
Well, I mean, the point is the Enlightenment is a very complex thing, right? I mean, there's a sense in which the term Enlightenment is a kind of artifact of history, and in fact it was moving in many different directions, even on the matter of democracy, of course, and liberty and all those sorts of issues. So, and this movement is kind of the same in having many different angles to it. Because if you think about the exact politics of being a creationist, of being an alternative medicine person, of being a person who denies global warming, that doesn't necessarily look very left. No, right? I mean, so it's a different way, there's a sense in which the political, issues are being changed in the process. But that happened in the 18th century too, it seems to me. So it's a complicated story, but it's unfolding, it's ongoing.
Next question, please. Professor Poza.
Thank you very much for your wonderful, vivid contribution. If you have spoken as a scientist, it could be paternalistic, what you say. If you had spoken as a customer, you would say, well, that's your personal opinion, and you say, much too much okay. If you have spoken as someone from humanities, you could say, well, think of Salvador and Madariaga, what is truth? It's a bundle of errors. Well, what is the outcome? What is the result with respect to the structure of science? Thinking of your example of L'Aquila, has been absolutely clear that they did their job correctly, absolutely correctly. People didn't understand what probability means. So one has to go on with the path of enlightenment within scientists. And my question, you spoke of the parallel of the Reformation and today. Reformation changed the whole theory of theology, at least within the Protestant church, and a while later, well, the Catholic Church as well changed the theoretical background altogether. Now my question is, what is it what should be changed within the scientific methodological commitments, which, due to that what you said, had been okay, at least in the case of Aquila?
I mean, I think the main thing that I suggested in the talk, it's certainly not the only thing, is I think we need to change our conception of testing. What does testing mean? Where does testing happen with regard to scientific beliefs? I mean, I mentioned in the talk about Francis Bacon and this kind of image that we have, that when a scientific hypothesis is tested, it is happening in a lab or in some kind of artificial space. But here what I'm suggesting is that in fact we have people who want to use their own lives as kind of the site for the testing of science. In other words, they want to live, this is why I say live the faith. They want to live their beliefs in this respect. And even if the scientists tell them there's a really strong chance that you're going to die as a result of this, they'll say, fine, I understand that. That's the customer moment. I understand what you're saying, but I don't buy it. I'm going to live this way. And the point is, we have to recognize that as equally scientific if the people are informed. Right? So it's a change in the conception of testing that gets quite broadened out and becomes actually part of what it means to live in a very explicit kind of way. I think that's, at least in terms of the talk, that would be the thing I would refer to, but there are other things as well.
So your answer would be, you should make a difference between experiments on the one side and tests on the other side, which in technology is used instead of experiments. And it's a completely different thing altogether.
Well, I mean, this is the thing. I think what we end up getting here is we get somewhat of a blurring, because the technology, when we're testing the technology, there are usually people involved in some sense or another. And so I think what I'm arguing for here is a kind of a continuum, you might say. Because of course there's we have a kind of very common sense notion of people learning from mistakes. Life is learning from mistakes, right? We do have people from Karl Popper onward who in a sense want to take that quite seriously as a kind of existential base. for then talking about the more sophisticated form of testing and experimentation that we have in science. And I'm saying, yes, let's go with that. Let's go with that, and let's kind of take it really seriously, which means that people's own lives can be long-term tests, not just learning from mistakes in terms of particular events, but actually, if you learn, if you live as if a certain theory is true, if you take a certain kind of dietary regime every day for 50 years, right? Yeah, that sort of thing. My key point, the key thing I would say, though, that I didn't mention here, that I think is very important, in order to keep all this in the domain of science, is that the consequences should be public. So even though they are privately absorbed, they should be publicly known, so that other people can make their own judgments in an informed fashion about what to do. So that if you take a certain kind of therapy and you die, I want to know that. Right? I, as someone else, want to know that. It is not just you, right?
One more question, please. I'm terribly sorry to interrupt you. We have one more question from Professor Sismondo, please.
Thanks very much, Steve. I agree with the trend that you're describing. I can see it all over the place. When my 13-year-old neighbor is developing operating systems, and there are synthetic biology hack labs, not too far away, and I can see all of that. But I'm interested in your suggestions, and I'm sure that there are going to have to be suggestions about how we address some of the political economies of knowledge around this.
Yeah.
Because, of course, one of the things that Ben Goldacre is objecting to are certain kind of cartels of knowledge, right? He's objecting to certain kinds of concentrations of power and wealth of knowledge that then that have interest at stake and that push certain ways of thinking about, especially medical science, forward. But we could talk about that in other realms. We could say, the sick building syndrome. We could point to the tobacco industry funding behind the sick building syndrome, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm interested in your thoughts about how, if we want to go for the Enlightenment ideal that you're pushing, that we maintain.
Look, I think that a key feature here, and you're right, Goldacre is very good on this, is that we need to incorporate political economy as part of the mechanism by which we weight science. But again, the model for this, in a way, is already present with investigative journalism in politics, right? Where there's a sense in which you actually do more than just to check to see whether the politicians are telling the truth. You actually want to get a sense of motivation and how this is constraining agendas in various ways, especially if we're talking about large numbers of politicians and we're talking about agendas moving in certain directions rather than other directions. In which case, then the political economy issues are obviously very important in politics. And I think what's important for this Enlightenment view is that also this gets incorporated into our evaluation of science. And in particular, I guess, that it's not seen as somehow external to science. Because I think one of the problems that we run into when we evaluate science is we still maybe see science a little bit too intellectual, even now. And as a result, we sort of see the issues of political economy that are typically responsible for having agendas move one way rather than another as somehow external to science. But in fact, they're very much part of what science is, just as much as the ideas are and the beliefs are and everything else. And so, and I think it's not hard for people to have an active interest in this. What I think may be lacking at the moment, and this is where where scientists who want to encourage the Enlightenment can be very helpful, is to provide models or accounts for how one should think about political economy. What is a good way for money to influence science? What's a bad way for money to influence science? How do you make judgments of this kind? People make a lot of intuitive judgments, but usually they're based on prior political beliefs, right? So if you don't like the oil companies, whenever they fund something, it's bad, right? This is kind of the logic that tends to operate. But is there some principled way of thinking about this matter? You see, this is, I think, the open question. Yeah, and that's where we need to do some work.
Thank you, Steve.
Thank you.
Very much.
Thank you.